Hello. In this video today, I'll present a brief summary of Charles Dickens' novel Pickwick Papers. This novel consists of 57 chapters, and for the convenience of understanding, I have decided to segment this summary into 3 sessions. This is the first session of the summary of the novel. The story of the novel starts in the year 1827 in London on May 12. On this day, in Pickwick Club, a club established by a person called Mr. Samuel Pickwick, who is an aged person, a simple-hearted person with a bald head, and a man of some scientific thinking, but he also displays a pompous nature. He displays that he is a man of profound knowledge or profound thinking. So he has established a club called Pickwick Club. On May 12 of 1827, this club holds a session of its members, and in this session, Mr. Pickwick presents his research paper on the source of Hampstead Pond and the theory of tittlebats. So, this paper is on the source of a pond, Hampstead Pond, and it is also about the theory of tittlebats. Tittlebats are little fishes found in the pond. So, the name of the paper itself shows how Charles Dickens is making fun of scientific investigation or scientific knowledge through this paper. So, after the presentation of the paper, a resolution was taken in the meeting that a travellers' society should be constituted, and this society should travel across the countryside outside the city of London with the objective of gathering knowledge about life. So, a 4-member travelling society is constituted with Mr. Samuel Pickwick as its head, and the other 3 members of the group are a person called Tracy Tupman. Tracy Tupman is a very fat old fella. The second person is Augustus Snodgrass. Augustus Snodgrass considers himself to be a poet, although he has never written any poem. And the third person who has to accompany Mr. Samuel Pickwick is Nathaniel Winkle. Mr. Nathaniel Winkle considers himself to be a man of great skill, a great sportsman, although he has never displayed his sportsman's skill to anybody. Through these 4 characters, Dickens is presenting a satire of human affectation, because Mr. Samuel Pickwick considers himself to be a man of profound knowledge, profound thinking, but his research paper's main subject is on insignificant things like sources of a pond or the theory of little fishes like tittlebats. Augustus Snodgrass pretends himself to be a poet, but he has never written any poem. Mr. Nathaniel Winkle pretends to be a sportsperson, but he has never displayed sportsman's skill. And Mr. Tracy Tupman, who is quite fat and also aged, but at times in the novel we will see that he seems to forget his own personality as a fat old man. So, as this decision is taken that this group of 4 persons constituting the Travellers' Society should go and visit the countryside outside the London city, the next day they board on a cab on a horse-drawn carriage and travel to the nearby town of Rochester. So, this is how the adventures of the Pickwickians start. So, their first halt is at the town of Rochester. While they were traveling in that cab, the cabman started describing them various impossible stories, fictitious tales, like his horse has been working with him for 40 years, his horse has been in service with him for 3 weeks without any sleep. And as the main purpose of these people traveling is to gather knowledge, whatever fictitious information is provided by the cabman, Mr. Pickwick was jotting down, taking down everything in his notebook. And therefore, the cabman grew suspicious of Mr. Pickwick and these group. He thought these men were spies. And therefore, when they reached Rochester, this cabman created a hue and cry and told people that these 4 men were spies, because they were taking down all the information that he was providing. When the Pickwickians faced this trouble of people gathering around them, suddenly a stranger came to their rescue. A stranger came and rescued them from the attack of the people. Later, the Pickwickians came to know that the name of the stranger is Alfred Jingle. And Alfred Jingle saved them, and they decided to pass the night. Mr. Pickwick and his companions decided to pass the night in an inn at Rochester. Since the travelers were very tired, they had some drinks, and Mr. Pickwick, Mr. Winkle, Mr. Tupman all went to bed early. But Mr. Snodgrass remained awake, because he knew that a ball dance party would be organized on the upper floor of the inn that night. So, he remained awake till late to enjoy the ball dance party, and he also invited Mr. Jingle to accompany him to that ball dance party. Mr. Jingle said that he had no good dress to attend that party. Mr. Snodgrass told Mr. Jingle that Mr. Jingle can wear Mr. Winkle's blue coat, since Mr. Winkle had already gone to bed. So, wearing Mr. Winkle's blue coat, Mr. Jingle accompanies Mr. Snodgrass to this ball dance party. At that party, Mr. Alfred Jingle gets very intimate, gets very close to a widow who was also attending that party. And as Alfred Jingle has this capacity to impress ladies, he was a kind of con man who could very easily impress ladies. So, this widow is also impressed by Alfred Jingle's courteous behavior. But another person called Dr. Slammer, a local person, was already hoping to court, to impress, to woo this lady. So, when the widow got impressed by Alfred Jingle, Dr. Slammer got very angry, and he left the ball dance party talking about revenge upon this person wearing the blue coat. The next morning, a soldier arrives at the inn, and he wanted to see the person who was wearing the blue coat the previous night. He said that he wanted to meet the owner of the blue coat there. The blue coat was owned by Nathaniel Winkle, but on the previous night Nathaniel Winkle was not wearing it. It was owned by Alfred Jingle, but Alfred Jingle had already left, and as a owner, Winkle came out and met this soldier, and this soldier told Mr. Winkle that a person called Dr. Slammer wanted to have a duel fight with him for the insult he felt the previous night during the ball party. Mr. Winkle was confused because he did not remember anything. He did not remember insulting anybody the previous night. He thought that he might have been drunk too much to remember anything, and he accepted this challenge of duel by the soldier, and he requested Snodgrass to accompany him to that place where this duel had to take place. So both Mr. Winkle and Snodgrass arrived at the place of where the duel had to take place. Dr. Slammer was already waiting for the challenger, but when he saw Mr. Winkle coming there, he understood that it was a mistake. Mr. Winkle was not the person who was attending the ball the previous night. So he allowed Mr. Winkle and Snodgrass to go back to the inn, and they reconciled. They forgot everything. Dr. Slammer forgot everything, and he also accompanied Mr. Winkle and Mr. Snodgrass back to the inn. When they arrived at the inn, Dr. Slammer actually saw there Alfred Jingle, and then he again got very angry, and he talked again of revenge on the Pickwickians. And when Dr. Slammer left threatening the Pickwickians with revenge, Mr. Pickwick got very angry and rushed after Dr. Slammer. But the other members of the Pickwick Club, the other three members, and also Alfred Jingle, they followed Mr. Pickwick and brought them back to the inn, and they had drink and slept. The next day, the Pickwickians visited a nearby town named Chatham, Chatham. A military drill had to take place the next day at Chatham, and the Pickwickians visited, like many other people, to watch the military drill, the mock military drill. There, the Pickwickians met one of the members of the Pickwick Club, Mr. Waddell. Mr. Waddell was also a frequent visitor at the Pickwick Club. Mr. Waddell was very happy to meet the Pickwickians at Chatham, and they had a nice time there. Mr. Waddell was there with his daughter Emily Waddell and his unmarried sister, his spinster sister Rachel Waddell, and a boy called Joe the Fat Boy. Joe the Fat Boy was not actually related to Mr. Waddell, but Mr. Waddell kept Joe the Fat Boy with him because of curiosity, because Joe the Fat Boy would do nothing but eat and sleep. At Chatham, when everybody was busy enjoying the military drill, Mr. Snodgrass develops or gets very intimate with Emily Waddell, and Nathaniel and Tracy Tupman gets closer to the unmarried sister of Mr. Waddell, Rachel Waddell. After the military drill got over, Mr. Wardle invited the Pickwickians to his own manor house, to his own country house at a place called Dingley Dell. So the group decided to visit Dingley Dell next. They were given a huge welcome by Mr. Wardle and his family at Dingley Dell. The next day, after reaching Dingley Dell, Mr. Wardle takes the Pickwickians for crow shooting, bird shooting. And during that shooting adventure, Mr. Nathaniel Winkle, who considered himself to be a great sportsman, he, while trying to shoot a crow bird, by mistake shot at Mr. Tupman, and Mr. Tupman was injured on his arm. And when he was injured by this shot in his arm, he was taken back immediately to the house. And the other members, including Mr. Wardle, they visited a nearby town called Muggleton, where a cricket match had to take place between the Muggleton team and the Dingley Dell team. But Tupman had already been taken back to Mr. Wardle's manor house. There, Tupman got chance to get very intimate and propose Rachel Wardle, because all the other members, most of the family members, most of the people there had gone to Muggletown to watch the cricket match between Dingley Dell team and Muggleton team. While Mr. Tupman was sitting very closely and embracing Rachel Wardle, they were seen by Joe the fat boy. And that evening, Joe the fat boy gave this information that Mr. Tupman was very intimate, was getting very intimate and was embracing Rachel Wardle. This information Joe the fat boy gave to the old family aunt, and the old family aunt got very angry to know this. She was very disappointed at Mr. Tupman, because Mr. Tupman was a fat, aged person. He forgot his own personality and got involved in this kind of a passionate relationship with a girl much younger than him. So through this episode also, Dickens satirizes human affectation, when people forget their own personality and gets into relationship which they should not get involved in. When Joe the fat boy was telling this thing to the old family aunt, Mr. Alfred Jingle heard it. Now, when the Pickwickians and Mr. Wardle were all at Muggleton watching the cricket match with Dingley Dell team, they met Alfred Jingle there. And when Mr. Wardle saw Alfred Jingle talking to the Pickwickians, he invited Alfred Jingle to Dingley Dell, his manor house. So when the group came back that evening, Alfred Jingle heard Joe explaining the closeness between Tupman and Rachel Wardle to the old family aunt. And immediately, Mr. Alfred Jingle designed a plan. He informed Mr. Tupman about the whole incident. He told Mr. Tupman that the family aunt had got very angry, very disappointed after knowing about their affair, his affair with Rachel Wardle. And on the other hand, he informed Rachel Wardle that Mr. Tupman was a man of dubious character. So, Jingle designed a plan to create some distance between Mr. Tupman and Rachel Waddell. Jingle successfully convinced Mr. Tupman to avoid Rachel Waddell for some days, so that all suspicions were removed from the mind of the old aunt. And Tupman happily accepted Mr. Jingle's suggestion, advice. He started avoiding Rachel Waddell for some days, and during those days, Mr. Jingle got closer to Rachel Waddell. We have already said that Mr. Alfred Jingle had this capacity of impressing ladies and girls. So, Rachel Waddell was also greatly impressed by Alfred Jingle, and after a few days, she accepted Alfred Jingle's offer to run away with him to London. Alfred Jingle planned this elopement thinking that Rachel Waddell had inherited a huge amount of money, and if he was able to marry Rachel Waddell, he would be able to own that money. So, the objective, the purpose behind Alfred Jingle's proposal and marriage proposal and love to Rachel Waddell was only that of money. So, Alfred Jingle and Rachel Waddell ran away, eloped to the city of London. The next morning, when Mr. Waddell came to know about this elopement, he was very horrified, and he told Mr. Pickwick about this, and Mr. Pickwick was also very disappointed. Both of them immediately decided to follow this couple, and they also arrived in the city of London in search of this couple, and they searched all the inns, all the lodges there, one after the other, looking for the couple. In one of the lodges, in one of the inns called the White Hart, there a bootman, a boot cleaner called Sam Weller, he ultimately provided the information that Alfred Jingle and Rachel Waddell were staying in that inn itself. Sam Weller told Mr. Pickwick that Alfred Jingle, after checking in that lodge, asked Sam Weller where he could buy a marriage license from, and Sam Weller first tried to dissuade, tried to prevent Mr. Alfred Jingle from buying the marriage license. For this, Sam Weller told Mr. Alfred Jingle the story of how his father Tony Weller was cheated by marriage license touts. Tout, T-O-U-T, tout is a person who tricks somebody to buy something or do something. So, Sam Weller's father, the bootman, Sam Weller's father, Tony Weller, was cheated by a marriage license tout. When Tony Weller's first wife, that is Sam Weller's mother, died, he left £200 for Tony Weller. So, after the death of the wife, Tony Weller tried to get hold of that amount of £200, and he went to a lawyer. When he went to a lawyer, he was surrounded by two marriage license touts. They convinced Tom Weller to buy a marriage license. When he agreed to buy that marriage license, the lawyer asked him what should be the name of the wife there in the marriage license. Tom Weller said that he did not have any idea of what name should be put, but later he asked the lawyer to put the name of Susan Clark. So this is how Susan Clark became the second wife of Tony Weller, and after marriage Susan Clark became Susan Weller. But after this marriage, Susan Weller got hold of all the money of Tom Weller, and she made Tom Weller's life miserable. But even after listening to this story from Sam Weller, Alfred Jingle did not hesitate to buy the marriage license. So he met the marriage license touts and bought a marriage license. So when Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle met this couple, Alfred Jingle showed them the marriage license. Mr. Wardle offered Mr. Jingle £120 to let Rachel Wardle alone, and Alfred Jingle happily accepted the amount as he said as a cost for the damage to his reputation for this affair with Rachel Wardle. So for £120, Mr. Alfred Jingle betrayed Rachel Wardle and left that place, and the heartbroken Rachel Wardle was now again taken back to Dingley Dell from London. When Mr. Pickwick arrived at Dingley Dell, he was told that Mr. Tupman had already left that place heartbroken. He was so much depressed because of the whole incident that he told everybody that he was going to commit suicide because of this betrayal by Rachel Wardle. So he left the place. Mr. Pickwick immediately followed the way on which Mr. Tupman left. Meanwhile, Mr. Tupman arrived at a nearby small place called Cobham, Cobham. When Mr. Pickwick arrived there in search of Mr. Tupman, he found Mr. Tupman enjoying a heavy meal, a heavy lunch there with a happy mood. So the man who left Dingley Dell saying that he was going to commit suicide because of this betrayal by Rachel Wardle, he was now found having a very nice meal at Cobham by Mr. Samuel Pickwick. So Dickens time and again exposing the pretensions of individuals. Here the target of his satire becomes Mr. Tracy Tupman, who showed himself to be so sad that he was going to commit suicide, but he was actually found having a great meal at Cobham. From Cobham, after finding Tracy Tupman, the group next decides to go back to London. Mr. Pickwick stayed in a rented apartment in London. The name of the landlady was Mrs. Bardell. Mrs. Bardell was a widow and she had a son. Before arriving in London, during his previous visit to the London city, at the White Hart Inn, Mr. Samuel Pickwick had already been very much impressed by the character of Sam Weller, the boot cleaner in that inn, because Sam Weller was a person of great worldly wisdom. He had great wit, and he used to speak using the Cockney dialect. In Cockney dialect, in his speech, there was dominant presence of the O sound. So he used to speak differently with the Cockney dialect. So in London itself, during the previous visit, Mr. Samuel Pickwick gave the offer of a servant's job to Sam Weller, and Sam Weller had already accepted the offer, and he had been accompanying the group since then. So Sam Weller went from London to Dingley Dell, from Dingley Dell to Cobham with this group, and now when Mr. Pickwick came back to his rented house in London, he asked Sam Weller to join him as his servant, and Sam Weller was very happy to accept this new job, because earlier he was having a lower position as a boot cleaner in that White Hart Inn. But if Sam Weller had to be a servant to Mr. Samuel Pickwick, Sam Weller had to move in with Samuel Pickwick into this rented house, into this rented apartment. But before this, Mr. Pickwick planned to take his landlady, Mrs. Bardell's permission. So he met Mrs. Bardell, who is a widow with a son. So Mr. Pickwick met Mrs. Bardell and asked him whether it would be troublesome for her to keep two persons instead of one, because earlier Mrs. Bardell was allowing Mr. Pickwick only to stay there. Now, since Sam Weller would work as Mr. Pickwick's servant, Mrs. Bardell now would have to allow two persons to stay in that house. This is what Mr. Samuel Pickwick was asking to Mrs. Bardell, whether it would be troublesome for her to keep two persons instead of one. But Mrs. Bardell misunderstood him. She thought that Mr. Pickwick was proposing marriage to her, because according to her calculation, she was earlier staying with one person, that is her son. Now she would stay with two persons. That meant Mr. Pickwick would marry her, and then two persons, that is Mr. Pickwick himself and the son, would stay with her. So this misunderstanding took place, and she got very emotional and gave an embrace to Mr. Pickwick, saying, "Oh my dear." At that very moment, the other three Pickwickians, Snodgrass, Tupman and Winkle, entered the room, and they were embarrassed to see Mrs. Bardell hugging Mr. Pickwick. When these three persons entered, Mrs. Bardell immediately drew herself back, and she fainted. She pretended to be physically weak, having some physical problem, and asked the people to take her to her room. After this misunderstanding, the next day Mr. Pickwick decides that they would be travelling now to a nearby town called Eatanswill, Eatanswill, where an election was taking place. So in the next session, we will start from this point that is the Pickwickians' visit to Eatanswill. Thank you for watching.